Just before we begin, I do need to mention that I played Persona 5 Royal. Royal being essentially an expansion on the Persona 5 game, with plenty of quality of life improvements and a whole new term with an extra palace. Persona 5 is a long-form, low-fantasy JRPG that is set in Tokyo and follows an unnamed silent protagonist after he gets expelled from school following a wrongful conviction of assault. Your character must navigate school life in a new school in a new area, where of course things quickly get complicated and the supernatural gets involved. But before I talk much about Persona 5, first I need to qualify a few things, because the thing is, usually I struggle to get into JRPGs. As I've said before, I don't really appreciate a lot of the tropes involved. In fact, I think up to this point, the only JRPG I've played that I'd recommend is Final Fantasy X, because it somehow manages to avoid a lot of them, while making the ones it does cling to feel really fresh and natural. Link in the description to my review of that. When I compare that to a really trope-heavy JRPG like Tales of Arise, for example, which I once watched about half of by modding for a friend who streamed it on Twitch, it really makes me question exactly what it is that I like from Final Fantasy X that I don't like in Tales of Arise. First of all, I really just want to put it out there that I don't think Tales of Arise is a bad game. I've never even played it. I've just watched someone else play about half of it and paid some attention to the story, and I didn't like it. It felt like a lot of the characters were caricatures to fulfill certain archetypes needed to drive the story and create conflict within the team to spice up an otherwise dull narrative. The game painted a beautiful world with a multitude of complications, which in my opinion not only made following the story difficult, but the world was so complicated that it needed several long exposition dumps to get the player up to speed, but also felt convenient and like they were only there to provide either a gameplay mechanic or a plot point. I think a lot of my aversion to these fantasy JRPG tropes might be from the fact that I'm kind of over anime. I've probably watched between 10 and 15 animes in my life, almost all about 10 to 15 years ago, and as much as I enjoyed most of them, I think I got tired of them quickly because I feel like animes often lean too heavily on their tropes. Some tropes are even so prevalent that they get their own name, like isekai. And I kind of feel like once you've seen about 10 different animes, you've kind of seen them all. On the plus side, it does mean that if you love these tropes, you now have thousands of hours of entertainment. But for me, at least in this regard, variety is the spice of life. Just while I'm writing this, I wonder what your favourite or least favourite RPG trope is. Comment below. Anyway, you're probably wondering what all of this has to do with Persona 5. Well, it's because on paper, I wonder if I shouldn't like Persona 5. In terms of its tropiness, I think it sits pretty nicely halfway between Final Fantasy X and Tales of Arise. Yet, I greatly enjoyed my time with Persona 5, even though it was a really long time. Seriously, I doubt a first playthrough of this game would give you change for 120 hours. I've said before, I don't usually like these super long form stories. So why on earth do I love this game? I think first of all, the low fantasy setting helps tremendously, especially at the start. The fact the setting is in such a familiar place means that off the bat, the game doesn't need to explain the world for you. It also means that when the supernatural elements do kick in, it's just as new to your character as it is to you. So, lo and behold, you meet a character who understands what is going on a lot better than you do, and so can explain gameplay mechanics and exposit without it feeling unnatural. The real-world setting also allows the story to deal with deep issues without having to explain the rules of the world and having to dream up reasons why the main characters' lives all suck. Which is an area I feel Tales of Arise falls down. And Persona 5 pretty quickly delves into some really serious issues, which my original script listed to make a point. But I don't think YouTube will be super happy with me if I do that, so just take my word for it. While some of these serious issues are dealt with by a pretty heavy hand, in my opinion, it never quite crosses the line to lame or offensive, and keeps the player gripped to the story. Something I was worried about going in was that I wondered how such a long story would keep me interested. Persona 5 does this by having several short stories wrapped up in the overall narrative. It starts off with a gripping and very personal enemy that takes place entirely within the school, keeping the world relatively small for a new player, equips them with all the tools they need to defeat this big bad, then, when he is gone, gradually introduce a new, bigger threat from outside the school. Because each new enemy is completely different, from extremely different walks of life, each of these plot loops, as I shall call them, feels entirely different from the last and keeps the narrative feeling fresh. I also love the way that each of these loops escalates in a way that doesn't feel entirely unbelievable, while also making the current enemy feel like the biggest challenge your team has ever faced. In a lesser game, I think this would have felt contrived, but the writing in Persona 5 makes this work. The only downside, I think, is that after a boss has been defeated, the game slows down significantly while another target is found, making the pacing kind of stilted. But luckily, the game encourages you to get to know the characters, and this, I think, is where the game really excels. While not all of the characters are great, a lot of them are. Certainly all of the party members have interesting, flawed characters with actual nuance, rather than being blunt instruments for plot roles. All of them suffer from some sort of trauma which is explained or shown by the game and explains believably why the character may act the way they do. All the characters are either likable or interesting, or often both, and well written enough that I find myself rooting for pretty much all of them. Seriously, the story is great at showing the player exactly why they should care about these characters, which brings the game world to life in an incredibly immersive and satisfying way. I also really like the way the game gives you dialogue options when spending time with someone, but if you say something that character doesn't like, it just means you'll have to spend more game time with that character. There are very rarely moments you can make a mistake that doesn't just take a few moments of real time to fix. Yet, the different dialogue options allow you to customize your experience in an often satisfying way. So far, I've raved about the modular story and the characters. Let's talk now about the gameplay. Combat itself, I feel, is pretty standard fare for an RPG. You have up to 4 active members in your party. Each member has a different elemental specialty, except the main character, who may switch. Interestingly, the defeat condition in Persona isn't the complete annihilation of your team, merely the death of your player character. This does occasionally lead to moments where a healthy team can suddenly be rendered useless by bad luck when a couple of enemies randomly focus the main character and melt through his HP before you even get a turn. But luckily, this is rare, and I don't think the game ever does this on purpose. I'd also go so far as to say that the combat is restrictive early game, with a low number of party members and a lot of mechanics you would usually take for granted in an RPG being locked behind other mechanics outside of battle. Seriously, an average player is unlikely to unlock even the ability to swap party members during combat until pretty late game. I think the only reason this kind of works is the fact that the game is so long and complicated, it can have a long run-up, which is good, because this game has a really long tutorial. Seriously, the game treats pretty much the entire first palace, which is what this game calls dungeons, as a tutorial area. Luckily, the training wheels start coming off partway through, because an average player is unlikely to have change for 15 hours to kill the first big boss. 15 hours for a tutorial mission? Some AAA games are barely longer than that. Outside of these fantastical palaces, the game almost entirely takes place in the real world, and uses a calendar system where days pass in-game, and after basically a year of in-game time passes, the game is over. This may make it seem like the game works on a time crunch, but the entire game is very much guided by this calendar, with pretty much all major plot events happening on preset days and only allowing the player a modicum of agency for when to complete certain important tasks. Everything else can be done whenever, once unlocked, in moments when the character's free time is allotted. So, outside of palaces and scripted events, a player may spend their in-game free time performing chores or watching a movie, for example, to increase their character's out-of-combat stats, Or maybe getting to know one of the plethora of characters, which not only provide little stories of their own, but also unlocks boons that help the player either in or out of combat. For example, getting to know the doctor makes her medicines cheaper to buy. Getting to know the teacher allows your character to go out more when otherwise he might be too tired to do any more activities in a day. And getting to know an actual party member will increase that member's stats and effectiveness in a palace. Getting to know these characters also gradually allows the player to create more powerful personas too, which are essentially masks that the main character can wear in battle. Each one entirely changes his moveset, elemental strengths and weaknesses, and stats. This all comes together into a very satisfying gameplay loop, where every action you take in the game feels like progress towards the ultimate goal, and keeps a player like me, who, remember, tends not to like long-form media like this, coming back for more. The time limit and on-rails story even discourages grinding in my opinion, which gets brownie points from me. Although a few of the characters are kind of cliché, the vast majority of them have storylines that are either sympathetic, relatable, or both, which not only nicely raises the stakes towards the end, but also makes it fun to spend time with them and experience their stories. This is important because the pacing of the overarching plot is a little weird. As I've mentioned before, after each palace the overall plot kind of checks out and takes a break for an in-game week or two. This would feel like a drag if spending time with the characters and experiencing their stories wasn't so much fun. These slower gameplay moments may not be for everyone, but for me, the palaces were often so intense that I found myself almost looking forward to the calmer moments where the game would let me get to know the side characters more. I do think that if the game wasn't so long, the mechanics would be a little too complicated. The way personas interact with Arcana, basically how well you know certain characters, and how they interact with one another by way of being merged together, with many other factors to take into account, takes a long time to get used to. Luckily, the game gives you plenty of time, so it never felt like a problem. Once you can get yourself over the learning curve, what you will find yourself with is a very engaging, customizable experience that will challenge you to create the most powerful and useful personas you can. Though it's worth noting that any attempt to min-max will forego the aforementioned lack of grinding. It's not all strawberries and cream. Like I said earlier, some of the themes are dealt with pretty heavy-handedly. The best example of this is almost certainly the teenagers versus adults trope that seems common in JRPGs. Maybe the fact that it's a long time since I was a teenager, but this did get pretty eye-rolly for me. It's mentioned far too often, and the one and only time your team have an enemy who is another teenager, it quickly becomes apparent that they are just another victim of an evil adult. It wouldn't be so bad if it didn't happen over and over again. We get it, adults bad. The only other thing I really didn't like about specifically Royal was that in order to unlock the extra turn provided by Royal, you need to make very specific actions within the game that the game doesn't tell you. So it is extremely easy, if you don't know what you're doing, to accidentally lock yourself out of the extra Royal term. Considering how long the game is, I do think this is a pretty big misstep. There should be more in-game to explain, if you don't do this before this date in-game, you will not be able to play the expansion. That's really my only decent gripe with the game, to be honest. If I was more into JRPGs, I could go into more specific gripes, like the fact that the main character can only be male. But that doesn't really bother me. And I could have a moan about that one boss everyone hates because it is really badly balanced and is really heckin' hard. And yeah, it's annoying, but it's such a tiny blemish on such a massive and impressive experience, it's barely even worthy of the lip service I just gave it. Overall, I think Persona 5 ticks a lot of boxes for me. Both the overarching story and the plot loops are fun and engaging. The characters are three-dimensional and have stories that are gripping and fun to experience. The gameplay is satisfying and engaging. The combat, while a little standard fare, is satisfying to engage with, and only felt unfair on the one infamous boss. Even the art style was more than adequate and deserves praise. I understand from fans of JRPGs that Persona 5 is generally considered as one of the best, and after playing all the way through, I can see why. Not a single element of this behemoth is fully bad, while I'd go so far as to say certain aspects are exceptional. The way the game makes you care about even the more minor characters is masterful, and no other game save Final Fantasy X and maybe God of War Ragnarok has affected me emotionally quite like P5. Any fan of JRPGs who hasn't already played this should strongly consider picking this up, especially now it's available on Switch and PC. But for people like me who generally avoid JRPGs, I'd still absolutely recommend Persona 5 as a great play. If you don't like the whole getting to know you trope, then maybe avoid, as it forms a pretty big part of the game. And I still stand by what I said in my Final Fantasy X review, that if you are only ever going to play one JRPG in your life, I would urge you to pick up Final Fantasy X. Aside from that though, I overwhelmingly recommend Persona 5.